the Enlightenment. Now, I'm developing an idea here. Probably others have thought it before, but the problem in dealing with this term enlightenment is, I think, that it has two aspects. The first is scientific, intellectual. The second is political, intellectual. And these two have some things in common, certainly. If the scientific enlightenment, let's call it, had not taken place, probably the political would not have taken place. But I think it's convenient to regard them as one movement that begins in one form, and then because of that form, assumes a political form. Anyway, let's begin. I would begin, best place to begin, I think, is Copernicus. Now, Copernicus was a Polish astronomer, and he waited until 1543, as he was dying, to publish his findings about the geocentric, that is the solar-centric solar system, let's say. That is, the medieval church, for various reasons, had taught that the Earth was the center of the universe. Solar system, universe, almost the same. That's not quite true. The center of the universe. This was convenient, and the Ptolemaic, Ptolemaic, the Ptolemaic conception of the universe fit very well with the medieval church's view of man and view of the universe. So let's discuss that first. This Ptolemaic conception, because it was beautiful, and it's worth emphasizing that it was beautiful. And in emphasizing this, it's worth emphasizing also that the conception of the universe that has replaced it, our own, is not beautiful. There's nothing beautiful about it. Okay. In the Ptolemaic conception of the universe, the Earth is at the center of the universe. The known planets, including the sun and moon, revolved around the Earth, each in its own sphere. That's how it stayed in place. There were 7 of these, and then the 8th circle around the Earth was the fixed stars, and then the 9th was the primum mobile, which for the first time was not visible. This consisted really of angels and setting everything in order. And then the 10th part, the 10th element in this conception was the Godhead, Father, Son, Holy Ghost, the Trinity, the Trinitarian Godhead. Now, what was beautiful about this was that we have the Godhead out here. We have the whole universe as a response to the Godhead. And what's really great is that the angels who were closest to God at certain times knew God best, responded to their knowledge of God with love and joy, knew God best, understand me, because they came closest. They were the outermost circle. Responded with great joy and force, and the force of that love and joy, in a sense, set the rest of the universe in motion. The whole universe then begins with God. God creates the universe, and each element of the universe, as it came closer to God, had knowledge of God and responded to that knowledge with love and joy, gratitude. Now, man on earth was at the point the farthest away from God in this universe. The earth doesn't move at all. It stays still. Why? Because the light just went off. Did you want to keep it on?
Yeah.
So, the earth is at the center of the universe. The earth and man on the earth are the farthest from God in this universe, have the least knowledge of God in this universe. On the other hand, the earth as the center of the universe and man on earth make up the central drama of the universe. The whole universe rotates. Okay, we're talking about the Ptolemaic conception of the universe, which was the conception of the medieval church. Now, the essence of this is that man was at the same time farthest away from God, had least knowledge of God, of all the creatures in the universe, and man's drama of salvation, man's quest for salvation, is the central drama of the universe. The whole universe is about man's drama, man's struggle for beatitude or perdition. This paradox is pretty beautiful, and the universe was a very orderly and beautiful idea. Now, along comes, I better explain. The Greeks, many of the Greeks had thought of the earth as rotating around the sun. This was not a new idea entirely with Copernicus, but Copernicus apparently proved it, or his arguments are very cogent and very forceful. Okay, so Copernicus dies in 1543. Am I saying that the Enlightenment begins with 1543? I think, yes, one must say that it begins with Copernicus. The change that was represented by his thought was so radical that, yes, that's where it begins. And he knew that it was radical and waited until he was dying to publish his findings, because he knew that the church would certainly persecute him. Now, when we talk about the church, we can assume then that the first 100 years, 150 years of the Enlightenment are a reaction, are almost an attack on the church, but only indirectly. They were not direct attacks on the authority of the church, really, on religious faith, but the little men in the church regarded these challenges to the earlier conceptions of things as attacks on the church. There's nothing new to this. People who attack religion can always attack religion in the sense of the authorities who govern churches. They're easy targets. They are seldom very enlightened people, and they always, of course, make mistakes. To consider this an attack on religion, I think, is totally wrong. To attack a religion, one must attack the beliefs of that religion. Then one is attacking the religion. No, one doesn't attack religion by attacking the governors, so to speak, of the particular church, in this case the Roman Catholic Church. Okay, but they were little men, worried about their secure position, very nervous and defensive and suspicious. Okay. Remember that Martin Luther, the Protestant Reformation had begun in 1517. It wouldn't be entirely wrong. Was Luther's Protestant Reformation and the others, Calvin and Knox and Zwingli and all these other guys, were they part of the Enlightenment? No, they certainly were not. It would be difficult to call the Protestant Reformation to consider it part of the Enlightenment. It is true, though, that it was a direct attack on the church, and it produced this very conservative, suspicious, protective, self-protective, defensive stance of the church. That's true. By the way, if one's really looking farther back, one could go as far back as St. Francis. I've talked about this before. The years, say, 1200 to 1220, the very apogee, the zenith of the authority and glory of the church, to look for its downfall. And one could even consider the Franciscan Revolution a kind of early Enlightenment, because Francis called for an examination and glorification of this world. But that's pushing things too far. The Franciscan scholars, though, were enlightened men who studied nature, studied this world with a new eye, an eye to understand and appreciate and glorify this world. And as such, they deserve a place as forerunners of the Enlightenment. So, as always in history, one can find cursors, forerunners, way back for anything. Okay, after Copernicus, what's the next step? That was 1543, so that's a very important date. The next step is probably, as far as I know, is Galileo. And Galileo is the prince of the Enlightenment in many ways. He's the hero of the... If there's one hero of the Enlightenment, I think it's Galileo. He is the first scientific genius who just towers above everyone else. And he became a kind of hero to the people who followed after him. They looked back to him for his courage, his intellect, his brilliance as a mathematician, as an inventor, and as a thinker. Anyway, because of his use of the telescope especially, which he didn't invent, but he made into something pretty great, he made many discoveries, like things about the moon and things about the universe, blah blah blah, and he was quite sure that Copernicus was right. He had some problems with the church. The church forced him to renounce his views. By that time he was a very old man, and he didn't want to be a martyr, and he was a faithful son of the church. He didn't consider himself as attacking the church, and of course he wasn't attacking the church. But the little men who were so watchful, who jealously guarded the authority of the church, we're going to see this again and again. Galileo's dates: 1564, very useful date. The date of the death of Michelangelo and the birth also of Shakespeare. Great date. I like dates. I'm a person who looks ironically a little bit at the study of history, because I think it's a very arbitrary and mythical enterprise. But if we're going to play the game of history, in my opinion, we need dates. And the people who don't know dates say very foolish things. I mean, imbecilic things, as I like to say. So, Galileo dies in 1632. Now, what's happening in the world in 1632? A very, very big event that's very important for the Enlightenment, political event, is the 30 Years' War. The effect of the 30 Years' War we tend to underestimate, but I think that without the 30 Years' War, the 30 Years' War had a huge influence on the Enlightenment. Here's how it worked. The 30 Years' War was fought mainly in Northern Europe, mainly in Germany. participants, sometimes, the French participated some, the Scandinavians, especially the Swedes, who had a very great, militarily great king, Gustav Adolphus, were part of it, and Czechoslovakia, the whole German realm, part of it. It lasted for 30 years, obviously, those 30 years key, and it devastated Germany and other places, but especially Germany. This really was Germany's religious war. The French had a religious war too, ongoing really, and we should mention that too. The Huguenots were the French Protestants, and on and off they were fighting with the Catholics for really 50 years. And it had a terrible effect on France, especially when Louis XIV, what's the term? Cancelled, I can't think of the term, but cancelled the Edict of Nantes in 1684, I'll say. When he cancelled that treaty, that meant the Protestants had to go. And millions, maybe, many thousands of French Protestants left France then, some for the New World, some for Holland, some for England, and this had a terrible economic effect on France, because these Protestants were middle class. Of course, they weren't the whole middle class, but they were a significant number of the middle class. The point is, I'll stop talking about these religious wars, which happened everywhere, but religious wars, all wars are pretty brutal, and atrocities are committed in the name of religion and God and all kinds of nonsense, just all kinds of stupidity. Religious wars really are a stupid spectacle. War is pretty stupid anyway, but what religious wars tend really to be, in my opinion, about is economics. It's too incredible to think that people would fight about some religious doctrine called even the Trinity or baptism or something, and persecute the Anabaptists for that reason. No, one can always find economic factors, and I think the economic factors are usually the guiding force, but not always. Not always. Anyway, I won't discuss that. But what I'm getting at here is that the Enlightenment is partly a reaction against the religious fanaticism of the 30 Years' War, primarily, the French religious wars too, and religious wars everywhere. Reasonable men thought, wait a minute, this is just too stupid. To fight over these things is simply too stupid. And so the reaction against the religious wars had a huge, immeasurable impact on the thinking of Europeans, and pushed the Europeans much more, Europeans very, to a great degree, toward secularism. Big word, secularism. Secularism is the view that religion is very nice, but after all, we must live our lives here in this world, and one can find support in the Bible. God told us to be fruitful and multiply and do whatever we want to the world, basically. But secularism is most of all a reaction against the fanaticisms and the excesses of the religious wars, and primarily the 30 Years' War in Germany. At the end of that war, 1/3, I think, of the population of Germany was dead. Well, that's pretty huge. Pretty huge. The last time such destruction had taken place had been the Black Death. I've talked about that elsewhere, of 1347 to 1350, basically, the bubonic plague. And that too, 1/3 of Europe, I know I'm going way back 300 years, but the effect of that was huge too in pushing people toward, I think, secularism. It was a blow that from which the Catholic Church, the only church around, never fully recovered because it raised such big questions about God's governance of the world and the teachings of the church, some of the teachings anyway. Of course, religion has never had a satisfactory explanation for gratuitous evil, innocent suffering, and the cruelty inflicted on people in this world. Of course, the best explanation is our nature, but we still must ask, why are we this way, the way we are? Why would God make us the way we are, capable of such cruelty and such ferocious? Okay, moving on. Galileo and the 30 Years' War. Now, we are now in the first half of the 17th century, and there the Enlightenment really begins. From that point of view, then, Copernicus is a forerunner or precursor, but the first giants of the Enlightenment are in the first half of the 17th century. They are Galileo, Bacon, Sir Francis Bacon. I'll discuss them in a minute. William Harvey, Descartes, Kepler. These are people who all lived in the first half of the 17th century, and they all had ideas, scientific ideas, which they arrived at through experimentation. This is key. The whole idea of experimentation and of inductive thinking, that is, finding evidence, and then experimenting, finding evidence and revising the theory, experimenting. Oh, and Pascal, I must mention Pascal too. Another hero of the first half of the 17th century. These men were scientists in the true sense. That is, they developed, and Bacon actually developed the theory of experimentation. That's what science is. A scientist has a theory, he tests the theory, he revises that theory, tests again, all of this in an effort to prove or to arrive at some truth, some scientific truth. Okay, well, this is the result of the thinkers of the first half of the 17th century, and that's where the Enlightenment, scientific Enlightenment, really begins. To discuss these people, William Harvey discovered that our circulatory system. Now, I'm not a scientist. I am an ignorant person in science. I only know what textbooks tell me. And many of you know much more than I do about these individual things, at least. But Harvey demonstrated that our blood circulates through our body. Well, this was revolutionary. Sir Francis Bacon believed in science and, as I said, discussed experimentation and scientific theory, critical thinking. Notice all of these people are thinking critically too, and this is important. That is, they are looking at the universe, man, the universe, with fresh. They are abandoning their conceptions, their preconceptions, and approaching life with critical intelligence, refusing to accept the traditional views of things. Of course, they have reason to reject these traditional views. Excuse me. Now, the one scientific giant of the early Enlightenment is Descartes. René Descartes, 1596, 1650. Dies right in 1650. How convenient. First half of the 17th century. He is the philosopher who provides the philosophical support for the Enlightenment. Basically, I could talk about him quite a while, but he's so important, maybe I will talk about him for 5 minutes anyway. A mild-mannered man who certainly didn't want to be a revolutionary, but he was a revolutionary in several ways. By the way, his discourse, his most important work, he wrote in French. Well, this was revolutionary already. And he wrote it in a very readable style, which makes him revolutionary among all philosophers. His style is easy reading. That's not easy to do, especially in philosophy, and very few philosophers have been successful at doing it. Descartes then wrote in French so that common people could read him, not Latin. He was the first to do this, and he wrote in this wonderful style, which is a pleasure to read, at least the discourse. Some of his other works he wrote in Latin, like the Meditations. Okay, now, what's revolutionary about him? Textbook style, he tells how he set out, he decided to doubt everything that could be doubted. And to doubt everything meant not only to doubt theories like any theory you like, but to doubt even that he was sitting in the room where he was sitting, near that stove, with the pen and paper before him. He doubted even that. That is, I better explain something. Skepticism, partly as a result of the religious wars, the fanaticism, skepticism was returning. Short side note, Pascal, a mathematician, a full-fledged experimental philosopher, an important scientist, had decided to write, oh boy, I have to go back again, sorry, Montaigne, as we say. Montaigne died in 1592. He's another forerunner of the Enlightenment. He is the prince of skeptics. In the whole history of skepticism, maybe, he is the prince of skeptics. An interesting, fascinating man. But he was a skeptic. Now, for him and all the skeptics, the most famous skeptics of the 17th century, skepticism went hand in hand with religion. And it still can, and in my opinion, it still should. That is, if I'm skeptical about everything, my own existence, my own sitting here in this room, under these circumstances, sure, I can doubt this. This can all be illusion after all. Can it be a dream? Of course it can be a dream. Is there any way I can prove that it's not a dream? None at all. There is no way to prove. I won't get onto my little theories, but I'll just say briefly, there's no way to prove anything at all. Period. Anyway, but this radical skepticism can accompany religious faith. In fact, can be a basis of religious faith. And this is how the skeptics of the 17th century operated. The question is always, were they sincere in talking about religious faith, or were they simply protecting themselves from punishment, persecution, by saying, we are believers? Now, they all went to church. Did they go to church sarcastically, ironically, let's say? No one can know. In my own opinion, Montaigne, maybe the greatest of them, was a skeptic in matters of religion too, but you can't prove it. What he said was always praise to God, praise to the church. How a skeptic can believe in one single creed, say the Roman Catholic Church's teaching, or any church's teaching, I don't see. And for that reason, I'm very skeptical myself about their professions of faith. But let that be as it will. The point is that skepticism can be the basis of religious faith. We have nothing else. We have nothing else. We have no knowledge of anything at all. Therefore, I or a skeptic is ready to believe that there is a God who cares about us somehow, and that's it. That's as far as we can go. Do we know anything about this God? No. But one can believe in such a God. The alternative is to believe nothing at all. And that's okay too. There are good reasons to believe nothing at all. Of course, we're assuming that even reason is valid, that reason can arrive at anything. That's a big assumption too. In fact, probably a false assumption, I would say. Reason, after all, is simply a human toy, a human invention, just like everything else we invent. But if we believe in reason, it's reasonable to believe in some God. And this, I think, is where Montaigne was. Anyway, Pascal set out to attack the skeptics, the doubters, the libertins, the doubters, and Montaigne especially. And he wrote his Pensées, his thoughts, in an effort to go beyond skepticism and lead people to the Catholic Church. His style and his manner of thinking are wonderful, though really he simply captures the essence of the skeptical thinking of Montaigne and others, and then he leads people by his wager, his bet, to bet that the Catholic Church is right. What do we have to lose? Only a few pleasures that aren't very pleasurable. What do we have to gain? Eternity, if the Church is right. Therefore, de l'eau bénite, take some holy water, cross yourself enough times, and if you do this enough times, faith will start to grow and everything will make sense religiously through God, and you will be saved. That was Pascal, and Pascal's important. Now back to Descartes. Descartes, as I say, philosophically began with doubt, doubting everything. And he did a pretty good job at it. But here's where the problem lies. He said finally he could not doubt that he was doubting. And the famous cogito ergo sum, I think, doubt, think, same, therefore I am, became the foundation of his philosophy. Now first let's find out where he was going with this philosophy. Where he wanted to go was, I exist. I think, therefore I exist. I must exist. I'm thinking. We'll return to that. I'm thinking, and therefore gradually he reconstructed the universe, but there are two very huge flaws in his thinking. He's a champion of philosophical thinking, but of course he made mistakes, because all philosophers make mistakes. And his two mistakes, I said, what did he want to do? He wanted to recreate the universe as a material reality and turn it over to the scientists. Well, this is gigantic. This is what makes him the father of modern thinking, even. A giant. He needed there are two flaws, two big mistakes in his thinking. One, I think, therefore I exist, is wrong. The fact that thinking is going on somewhere does not prove that I, Cook, exist. And it certainly does not prove my physical existence. It proves that there is maybe some thinking being. Named Cook? Not at all. My physical existence? Not at all. That has not been proved, and of course is not provable. The second flaw, the gigantic flaw in Descartes' thinking, is he needs God to prove the existence of the universe. That is, he needs this famous idea, a loving God would not deceive us, therefore I, physically, and the universe exist. Come on, that's cheating. No. And this is an important idea to me, and I think I'm doing okay here, because what makes us think that this loving God wouldn't deceive us in these matters? Because what does God really want? Assuming the Christian God, or an omnibenevolent God, God wants our faith and love. God wants us to turn from our wickedness and trust and love Him, and do good things, do righteousness, and walk with God in justice. What does our knowing about the material universe have to do with that? Nothing at all. Nothing at all. So this idea that a loving God would not deceive us about the universe is all simply self-deception. It's all more of our nonsense. It's more of our desire really to do without God. The idea that a loving God would not deceive us is yet another trick that we play, because really we want the universe without God. Or we want God in our terms. That's a little more accurate. Okay, back to our guys now. We have now finished the first half of the 17th century. I'll skip Kepler, who was an astronomer, died in 1630. These are real heroes. Now, in the second half of the 17th century, there is one giant, the equal of Galileo, and he's Newton, Sir Isaac Newton. Strange story, strange man, unlikable man, but absolute mathematical and scientific and almost philosophical genius. Because of his achievements, many of which I don't understand at all, the universe was established as a mechanism, basically, a mechanism governed by laws of matter and motion. Laws, physical laws, physical laws of matter and motion govern this universe. We need a God to create this universe, I suppose, but we have taken a giant step toward this idea of deism. And deism is simply the view that, yes, there is a God. This God created the universe, created the laws of matter and motion that govern this universe, and then stepped away from the universe. Has little to do with it. And so we can discover these laws, discover how the universe works, and ultimately make the universe, or make our world, a better place through reason. Reason now has become God, almost. Human reason has become God. Well, this, of course, is absurd. No wonder the Enlightenment. One aspect of the Enlightenment is it is the low point of theology in Western history, or at least in the Christian era. The low point. Theologians, well, there were no giants of theology during this time. We have, no wonder, this was the age of reason. As such, a lot of silliness. The belief in progress, which is so silly. The belief in the perfectibility of man, which is arguably the most absurd idea ever taken seriously by human beings, by serious human beings. My God, perfectibility of man? My God. It's just too obviously false. All one has to do is look inside oneself to find that utterly absurd. All this in the age of Newton, because Newton dominates. By the way, Newton's dates 1642. So he was born 10 years after Galileo died in 1727, well into the 18th century. Now, in 1662, before Newton was very active, an important thing happened. The Royal Society was established in London under royal protection. This was King Charles II. And 4 years later, Louis XIV in France established the French Academy of Sciences. This meant that royal protection was extended over these scientists, even in Catholic France, because scientific theories inevitably clashed with the teachings of the Church. Now, it would take time, but the Catholic Church has never been very good at this. After all, the Catholic Church opposed all kinds of, opposed the Copernican universe, I think, until the 19th century. Just incredible. One can say a lot of nice things about the Catholic Church, but incredible obscurantism, resistance to new ideas, which, well, it's embarrassing. The Catholic Church is an embarrassment to the thinking people, I think, in many ways, since the Council of Trent. The Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563, had been established to oppose the spread of Protestantism and to renew the Catholic Church. But the Council of Trent in northern Italy, where the leaders of the Church all gathered for 18 years on and off, also established the basic beliefs, the dogmas of the Catholic Church. And therefore, and these were not overturned, many of them, until Vatican II in about 1950. 1950. Embarrassing. A lot of good things about the Catholic Church, but its obscurantism is an embarrassment. Okay. Now I'm going to pass, about on schedule for the last 20 minutes, to the political aspect of the Enlightenment, because until now everything has been scientific. The scientific Enlightenment forms the foundation of the political. The political Enlightenment is especially important in France. It's a French phenomenon almost. But the French were inspired by the British, and all the French philosophes, time to use that word, is spelled like philosopher without R. A philosophe is French for philosopher, but a philosophe is not the same as a philosopher. A philosophe adopts critical thinking, l'esprit critique, critical view of the traditional teachings, especially of the Church. And although many of the philosophes claimed to be and tried hard to be faithful Catholics, it was hard, because the Church was so monolithic, so stubbornly obstructionist to scientific inquiry, critical thinking, scientific experimentation. Okay, so the philosophers were inspired by the scientists, through Newton, all the great scientists. The philosophers, by the way, we think of as beginning in about 1715. 1715 is a good date because that's the year of the death of Louis XIV, Louis XIV at last. Louis XIV was the Ancien Régime, that is the old regime of absolutism, divine right of kings, all these things that had to go. But no criticism of the Ancien Regime could begin until the death of Louis XIV. When he died, it was fresh air blew through France. A period of very immoral and important for the philosophers. 10 years followed the Regency before Louis XV could take over, the grandson, or the great-grandson, I'm sorry, the great-grandson of Louis XIV, who had lived so long. During the Regency, very little royal power, a period of immoral, fun, hedonism, and also intellectual inquiry very rapidly blew through France, and the French Enlightenment was now a very active phenomenon. So philosophers. The philosophers, I would begin with 1715. I'm going to name some names. Montesquieu, we say, is the earliest one. And he was an important aristocrat. Half of these guys were aristocrats and half of them were bourgeois, middle class. And Montesquieu basically opened the door to critical thinking about government. He was inspired by John Locke, and I have skipped Locke, so I better not skip him. In England, Locke, Hobbes, Thomas Hobbes, these guys were important thinkers about what government should be. Ideas like government should be by the consent of the people. Government should benefit the majority of the people. Rights, excessive rights of the aristocracy or of royalty had to be done away with. Government had to be more rational, more reasonable, more just. Well, these were big ideas which could be published in England because England was relatively open. I don't have time to discuss why, but the political Enlightenment really begins in England, it must be said. And there is Newton, the Englishman, so that in many ways the British took over the Enlightenment for a while, for that mid-period, I would say, from 1675 to about 1725. That was the period of when the British dominated the Enlightenment. But then the French, the philosophers, were inspired by the Brits, especially by Locke and Hobbes, and they dominated the rest of the 18th century. Now, some of their thinking became very radical. Radical means change the roots. For example, doing away with a king altogether. Most of them would have accepted this. Remember that England had a king, still has a king. This was radical thinking, but the British had executed their king, King Charles I, in 1641, I think. That was pretty radical during their Civil War, Puritans versus the Royalists. And everyone had been shocked about that. So the British had inspired a lot of, most of the the Enlightenment's political thought. Montesquieu, I mentioned, and he discussed one of his books is The Spirit of the Laws. And there he examines what law is and what law should be and what a constitution. Everyone agreed that government required constitution, should be constitutional. Really the only question is king or no king. And as you know, several European countries still keep kings, including England, Holland, Sweden, maybe Spain. These places still keep kings, even in the 21st century. Why? Because they think it adds some dignity, a kind of father figure, and they accept that. These are not foolish people. They have a view which Americans regard as anachronistic, that is hopelessly old world, but those four countries, the people of these four countries are very enlightened people. After all, the Dutch, the Swedes, my God, the Dutch and the Swedes, supreme Protestants. England, sort of Protestant. Spain, supreme Catholics. All of them have kept monarchies. Remarkable. Okay, other countries too, like Thailand and other countries in the world. Okay, back to our Enlightenment then. The most important of the Enlightenment figures is probably Voltaire. And I discussed Voltaire's Candide, very important to me, seminal to me, in another tape, so I won't repeat all that. But Voltaire was a hero in many ways, a strange little man, irritating in many ways, but a very witty, very intelligent, and really courageous man, who spoke out against injustices, terrible injustices committed especially by the church, and suffered some discomfort. Twice he spent time in the Bastille, the political prison that was the symbol in Paris of the Ancien Régime, of the traditional absolute monarchists. Twice as a young man he spent time there. Much of the rest of his life he spent outside of France, protected by various people. Frederick the Great of Prussia, several years, to his credit, protected Voltaire, admired him a lot. And then in Sweden, where his estate was safe from the King of France. But a courageous man in many ways, and he deserves credit for it. A witty man, a supremely witty man. One saying of the French is, in France, everybody wants to be Voltaire. Well, that's exaggeration, but it's true. That is an ironic wit, a man of such vast wit, and it's kind of true. Still. Okay. His most famous work is Candide, but Candide is not particularly a work of the Enlightenment. Candide goes beyond the Enlightenment. In my opinion, the world has still not caught up with Candide, and I'm going to try to change that a little bit in my own little way. Okay, third of the philosophes, Rousseau. Rousseau's influence, vast. It used to be thought that Rousseau's influence was second only to Saint Francis during the last, say, 1,000 years. Well, that's interesting. I don't quite accept that. I think Luther's influence was at least the equal. But huge influence, this little man, this strange little man with his autodidact education, that is, he was mostly self-educated, who jumped back and forth between Protestantism and Catholicism, who had these strange ideas about nature. Let's get right to the heart of it. The heart of Rousseau's thinking is his thinking about nature. As such, he's the father of the Romantic movement, and we still have not escaped him. Everyone who has spasms about Gumgang San, it seems to me, is a son of Rousseau. Now, it's not an accident that Rousseau is writing at the same time as the Industrial Revolution is beginning, because the Industrial Revolution is kind of the third aspect of the Enlightenment. I don't think the Industrial Revolution can be seen separately from the Enlightenment. So we have first the scientific revolution, those heroes. Second, the political thinkers, especially the philosophes, Locke, Hobbes, Locke, and the French philosophes. And then third, we have the Industrial Revolution, third aspect of the Enlightenment. Have we escaped from the Enlightenment in the 21st century? No. No. We are still very much caught up in the Enlightenment. We are still in the Age of Enlightenment in many ways, especially if we include Rousseau as part of that Enlightenment. But that's not quite fair. When because Rousseau emphasizes emotion so much. Let's make sense of Rousseau. For Rousseau, nature is everything. Nature is God. Okay. And we must get to God through nature. By rejecting the trappings of civilization, laws, formal education, these things get in the way, impede our progress to nature and God. Nature good, reason less good, if not evil. Emotion good, intellect less good, if not evil. This is the core of Romanticism, and all this is Rousseau. He is the father of Romanticism, but at the same time, this strange man was a philosophe, and was recognized as a philosophe. poor tormented man who fought with everyone, obviously paranoid, fought even with Hume. I haven't mentioned Hume yet, and I haven't mentioned Kant yet. And they must be seen as part of the Enlightenment too, but I'll get to them in a minute. Rousseau, a giant, with his ideas about education, a giant. The fourth of the philosophers, major ones, is Diderot, and I mentioned Diderot mainly because he was the father of the Encyclopédie, the encyclopedia. All of the Enlightenment figures in France wrote articles for this vast undertaking called the Encyclopedia, which had to be published outside of France because of the church, because it represented an attack on the church. But it was a collection of all the enlightened thinking about science and government that was then going on. Diderot was the mastermind of this. Diderot was the editor. Diderot wrote dozens of articles for the encyclopedia too, so that the Encyclopédie became the symbol of the French Enlightenment. It leads directly to the French Revolution, because all of these thinkers were in one way or another revolutionary thinkers. All of them thought about law and government, realized that kings had no place in these things, for France anyway. The church's control had to be diminished, if not eliminated. And the common man had to be protected and had to have rights. A democratic, republican form of government, voting, had to be initiated. Women had to be able to vote too. New ideas about education, all this. The encyclopedia, which was published on and off for about 25 years, under Diderot, became the symbol of that. Finally, I'll end with a couple of comments about Hume and Kant. They complete the Enlightenment in a formal sense. David Hume was a Scotsman, skeptical. In his most lucid moments, I believe, an absolute skeptic about everything, and as such a hero of mine. But then he did come up with his philosophy, which kind of in some ways contradicts his skeptical moments. As such, he becomes another Pangloss and another Zophar for me. See the other tape. But a brilliant man, and also a very good man, admired by everyone who knew him, was thought to be an agnostic. As he said, an atheist is a fool, because I think that's true, because an atheist is making a statement which cannot, it's a statement of faith. I believe that there is no God, is all that an atheist can say. Obviously can't prove it. Well, this is beyond what a person can say. A theist is even on a theist is on more solid grounds than an atheist. So Hume was never that. Hume was an agnostic skeptic, and perhaps a fideist, that is, a person who bases faith on skepticism about the possibility of human knowledge. Finally, Kant tried to deal with the skeptics, tried to get around skepticism. His philosophy is an attempt to circumvent skepticism. In the end, he too is skeptical. We can't know objects, we can't know noumena, we can't know physical reality at all. We can only, by the categories of our mind, approach through our own organs phenomena. Kant is considered to have instituted a Copernican revolution, so this is a good conclusion for our lecture here, by turning philosophy around from focus on the external world to focus on the internal world, the mind as it perceives reality, because reality is only in our minds, as a result of the categories of through which we see reality. Reality as it really is, we cannot know. Well, this is the Copernican revolution in philosophy, which Kant was responsible for, and it too initiates romantic thought, romantic thinking, romanticism, by internalizing and focusing on the inner workings of man. And that's a good conclusion for us.